All right, everybody, welcome back to another Ask a Dev Blueprint Fundamentals. It turns out that a lot of people have never built a UI before, and there are some fundamental pieces of that about where to even begin, how to even start to think about it, and that is exactly what we're going to be talking about today. And we are going to be building this UI that you see here. Now, the best way, this is a mock-up. Best way to think about this is if this was our game, let's say we had created all these beautiful trees in this forest and everything, and part of our gamer experience, we wanted to have a UI on top of it. Our UI is going to include two parts for this demo. The first part is some kind of heads up down here at the bottom. These could be items, this could be health bars, whatever, it doesn't matter. These just are placeholders. And the second piece is maybe something we can use to store a list of objectives or a list of buttons that you can click for debugging purposes, etc. But the point is we have some visual elements, some accents, and then we have some actual pieces that we're going to be using and we want to be able to click on, etc. So how do we even start to break this down? And this is where we get into, if you've never done web design and you've never done any kind of UI layout in Unreal Engine, I'm going to try to help give you a couple things to think about. So as I mentioned, this is our game. If you think about your game as a window, what we want to do is we want to add our heads up display to the window. Well, so basically what we're talking about is we're talking about being able to take this portion of our window and have a widget on top of it effectively. Well, so what we're going to do is we're going to basically use this square border as a placeholder for the heads up display at the bottom of our screen. And the heads up display itself is also going to get broken down. It's going to get broken down and sliced up into sections. And we're going to use each of those sections and we're going to stick them all together like a bunch of Legos in order to build what looks like this, perfectly laid out UI. So to do that, we might, as an example, we might cut this top piece into one piece, and then we would take, maybe we'd take each of these buttons and we cut them into their own little pieces. So we'd have a whole bunch of little cutouts. And then like I said, we're going to export those, import this into Unreal, and we're going to take all those and make a UI out of it. Now the same thing applies over here for our menu or objectives or whatever we want to call this, except the interesting thing is, we have a couple accent pieces. This top piece is really just a border, kind of a bookmark end. And if you think about this, what we've got is we've got the overall size of our layout, which is the larger rectangle. And then we're going to cut this to be a top piece, for example, a bottom piece, for example. And then we're going to take one of these button looking things, and we're going to cut that out and make that a reusable button that we can use in our interface. So we can have 3 rows, 10 rows, 1 row, however many we want with these nice, pretty bookends at the top and bottom. So the way we're thinking about this is how can we carefully lay out and cut up our desired interface so that we can stitch it back together in a reusable way and display that in Unreal. So we've got the cut up pieces. We know what we're building. What do the tools look like that we can build this with in Unreal Engine? Let's take a look at that now. So here we are in Unreal Engine. And generally speaking, the way this works is when you're dealing with UI, we're working with user interface widgets. They're called widgets. And they do kind of what they say. It's a widget that allows you to display things in Unreal Engine. So let's create one. What we're going to do is we are going to create, down here in user interface, I'm going to create a widget blueprint. And in this case, we'll just go ahead and use user widget. I'm going to call this widget blueprint HUD because that's HID. Let's make a HUD. We're going to be building our character's HUD in this case. Now we're going to have this nice gray box background instead of this pretty background that it would be our game experience, but it's still going to work the same. Now, Before we get into the tools that are available to us, let's talk a little bit about what's available in a widget blueprint editor. So over on the top left, generally speaking, default layout, this is our palette. These are all the tools that are available to us to use to start to build our Lego version, our assembled version of our final UI. The bottom left is the current hierarchy of our UI. The middle, this is the visual of what it looks like so far. And then over in the top right, something that's worth noting is you'll notice that when you're in the HUD editor, or I'm sorry, the widget blueprint editor, you have two modes, your designer mode and the graph mode, just like Anim blueprints or other blueprints, for example. In this case, the designer is the visual and the graph is where our normal visual scripting and node logic is all displayed. So we can do things like react to a button click. We'll get into that a little bit later. So in our designer, let's start with the basic. The very basic thing is, let's add this widget to our characters so we can even see it in Unreal when we start to play. But we want to be able to see something. So let's take a look at a couple of our options that we can use over here from our palette. And we're going to keep it simple. We're going to be discussing panels and common here in a minute, but if I were to drag a border down in here, you'll notice I get a nice white border that shows up. It's basically a box, and if I click on it, I can change all the colors and all the attributes and everything that are here. Now, don't get confused by content, color, and opacity versus the appearance. The appearance is where you actually, the brush it's called. What is this brushed with? This is where you actually can change it. So let's change this to a nice blue, for example, and let's make it semi-transparent just so we can see our character in the background behind it so we know it's properly working. So this is the simplest of a UI that we are now going to attach to our character. Now, there are a couple of different ways for us to add this to the character. I want to explain a few of those so that we can use that as our backdrop before we start getting into the creative part of the UI. So let's just compile and save that to start with. Then over here I've opened up my blueprint third person character. You can find this one in third person blueprints. This is the third person demo project or starter project. Okay, so double clicked on our third person character, and what we are going to do is explain to you a couple of nuances of how you add your widget. So if I just go ahead and click on my third person character and I choose add and I type widget here, I can select my widget. It now shows up. I'm going to call this the HUD just so that I know it's the HUD. And over here on the right, if I play, nothing's going to show up yet because we haven't set what the widget actually is yet. So there's a couple of things that we need to specify. One is, how is this widget going to be displayed in world space or screen space, and what the widget class is. That's the most important one for right now. So let's just go ahead and choose our widget blueprint HUD that we were just making. And let's just go ahead and see what that looks like when we play. Okay, you'll notice we don't see anything. So that is because if we come back here, we need to switch this to screen space. When we do that and we press play, you'll notice that we have our widget. It's a nice blue semi-transparent background that is available to us to look at. One of the things that you should have noticed when we were playing was, look at the size of this. This is a perfect square. That does not match what we have displayed here in our widget that we're creating. Why is that? That is because it is important to understand there is a draw size here. Okay, this draw size controls the actual sizing of this widget. Now, so if we wanted this to be our current size, I believe is 1280 by 720. If we wanted this to be 1280 by 720, we could specify 1280 by 720 in our draw size. And now when we play, you'll notice that we now have a 1280 by 720. However, this has problems. If we scale this screen, it scales, but it never touches the edges. It's not stretching or squashing or anything like that. So it's important to understand that as you build your widgets, there are ways for you to anchor the edges or not, depending on what your desired outcome is for the particular widget you're working on. If we go back to our third person character, I'm going to show you a second way to add the widget and what the difference is. So let's delete our HUD. We gotta stop playing first. Let's delete our HUD, and in begin play, let's add the widget. So what we'll do is we'll add a widget. That's not what I want to do. Let's get our player, hold on, let's get ourself. Let's get a controller. Okay, because we're going to need both of these. And let's create a widget. Create a widget, not add a widget. So we'll create a widget, and the owning player is going to be, we need to cast this to player first. Cast to player, my mistake. So our owning player is going to be us. Okay, and the widget we're creating this time is our HUD. Now, when we create this in Blueprint on begin play, if I compile and play this, it's not going to show yet. It's not here yet, because there's one more step that we need to do. We need to actually tell it to add it to the viewport. Now, this is very cool when we do this, although it doesn't show up. If I go, I can take this and go add to viewport. What I want you to notice is when we mouse over this, read what it says. It says it adds it to the game's viewport and fills the entire screen, unless set desired viewport is called to explicitly set the size. So what's cool about this method is we are going to add this to the viewport, and you'll notice that rather than being a box on our screen, it's kind of in the corners. So let's take a look at that this time. So when we play now, our HUD fills the entire screen. And the cool thing about that is as we scale it, it scales. So depending on how you add your widget and your goal, you may need to change a couple of things. You may need to do more work. So on one hand, if we just add it to the third person character, we have to do the work to actually size it and anchor it. On the other hand, if we do it in Blueprint, we have to do the work to get the controller to add it, to create the HUD and add it to the viewport. But we've reached our first step, which is great. We have created our first widget blueprint, which is our HUD, and we've added it to the screen. And now we can start to get into understanding how widgets work. So remember what I said. The goal here is we are going to be dividing up our screen into what the sections that we're going to be using to display, as an example. Now, something that I find that's important to understand is how each of these layouts and panels and everything can go together for you to create your cookie cutter or your Legos as you're building your UI. So we already have a border in here. The cool thing is, if we look at these, if we mouse over, it will tell us what it is. A border is a container widget. It can only have one child. So that way you can surround it with a background image or adjustable padding or anything you want to know. So this particular widget it's good, but it could also be limiting depending on what you're trying. Generally speaking, when it comes to the layout, how all of your little sub pieces are going to be created, you're going to want to use one of the panels. But let me show you as an example. Let's say that we wanted to put an image in every single corner of this widget. If I take and I drop an image inside this border, and I try to drop another image inside the border, I can't. A border can only have one child. So that does not work. So rather than using a border, I could use, for example, an overlay. Now, let's talk about these. An overlay, if we mouse over it, it will tell us it allows widgets to be stacked on top of each other. Use a simple flow layout for content on each layer. So unlike a border, what we can do is we can drop our overlay in here. And with our overlay, we can drop an image in. Let's take our image that we had dropped in, and you'll notice it shows up in the top left corner. If I drop in another image, it's also in the top left corner. So let's take a look at what we can do to get our images to shift around. Generally speaking, in each of our pieces of our palette, in this case the images, what we're able to do is there's a lot of alignment settings and things like that that we can use depending on who their parent is. In the case of an overlay for an image, if you look over here in the top right, we can set our alignment. So if I take my second image and I choose to right align it horizontally, you'll notice my image pops over to the right hand side. Now I'm going to duplicate this image again, and I want this one to show up at the bottom. So I'm going to line this to the right and the bottom. And then finally, we're going to do one more, and this one I want to be left and bottom aligned. So I now have an image in all four corners of my HUD. The reason I like putting an image in all four corners of this HUD is it's going to help me explain and help you visualize what is actually going on in the sizing as we start to stack this. But if we take a look when we play, you'll notice that I have white boxes in all four corners, which is great. Now let's go back to our widget and start playing around with a couple other things. Another widget that you can use is a canvas panel. And if you read it, it's designer friendly panel. It allows you to put out your widgets in arbitrary locations, anchored and Z-ordered. What is Z-ordered? Z-order is a way of saying how your individual elements stack. So if I have two buttons and they're on top of each other, which one displays? Depending on the Z order, it may show the red or the green or whatever it is that's happening, as an example. That's what Z order means. So this, and it even is nice enough to tell us it's a great widget for manual layout, but it's bad when you want to procedurally generate widgets. So for example, what does that mean? If you know that you want this button to show in the exact 45 pixels in and 25 pixels down, that's kind of a good opportunity to use a canvas panel. But if you are going to be procedurally generating, meaning let's say you have a menu, you don't know how many buttons are going to be in it, you probably don't want to use this one, for example. All right, so but if we were to drop a canvas panel in here instead, and this is, let's see what the difference is here. And I'm going to show you one quick trick. If I right click this overlay, I can choose replace with, and I can choose canvas panel. All right, so let's do that. Let's do this exact same exercise with our four images, but using a canvas panel. Oh, now you will notice the minute I swap this for a canvas panel, all four of my images are all now stacked. And it's because, and you'll notice this green border. This green border is showing the whole size of my canvas panel, but the image location is set. Where's it set to? It's set to a position of X and Y with anchors. If I click on my anchors, I can choose what these are going to be. So let's try to put this second image top right, okay? But this anchor is not where it's anchored on the image. It's where the anchor is for the individual element. So I don't actually want to change that. Let's see here. We want the anchor to be, in this particular case, we have our sizes. I believe we want these to be 30. Let's go 32 and 32. Let's make this the right size. And then to position it, what we can do is, let's say this is 1280. Let's move this over by, oh, actually this is 1980 now. Let's move this over 1900. Okay, so you'll notice my box shifts over to 1900. If I put my anchor on the top right corner of the box and I go negative 32, what's happening is this button, this image, sorry, it's not a button yet. This image, I've moved its anchor to be in the top right corner of the image, and then I have set its position to be negative 32. So there's a little bit more work when I'm doing this with the panel. So if we take this one, I want to, by default, it's sized to be 100 by 100. I'm going back to our little squares. If I wanted to anchor this in the bottom, if I go bottom left, and then I zero out our position. Okay, you'll notice that it pops down here to the bottom, but I need to offset it back up so we can go -32. And now our button is now, or our image is now anchored in the bottom left and shifted up to be in the bottom corner. And then finally, let's go to the bottom right. And when we do that, we'll set these back to 0. So now we're in the bottom right. We need to make our size be the same. And then we're going to go ahead and shift this in both directions, -32, for example, -32. Okay, so now we have all of our images are the same. When we press play, you'll notice that they still show up where they're supposed to be. A little bit more work because I can now specify exactly what I want to happen. So if we come back in here, if we grab our top left image, I can now position it manually just by dragging it. So let's go ahead and make this square like we had the other ones. If I decided I wanted this here and I wanted to be a little bit more specific about it, now when I play, you'll notice that this button shows up inset based on the number of pixels that I've actually specified as part of the canvas layout. So great for arbitrary layouts. We're not going to use this one today. Let's go ahead and replace this with our briefly, I would say the biggest ones that I use the most are canvas, depending on how arty and detailed I want to be, horizontal, vertical, and overlays. So what is a horizontal? Horizontal is basically, let me just let you read this real quick. If we take a look at our horizontal box, it allows widgets to be laid out in a flow horizontally, but it gets tricky. So let's replace our canvas with a horizontal box and show you the difference. Okay, so what we've got is we have a horizontal box with 4 images in it. Now, this is important to understand. You'll notice that all of our images are being stretched. We have 4 images because what's happening is you'll notice the sizing, and this is important to understand. The controls that you have available for the children will change based on what the container is. So for a box, you'll notice we don't have all the anchor stuff that we had for the canvas. For the horizontal, all we have is auto and alignment. So if I take this button and I want to align it to the top, even if I specify, here we go. So now we can get top aligned image. Now, if I take this second image and I bottom align it, I'll have one set to the bottom. Now, however, because this only works in a horizontal row, I can't actually have just a horizontal layout. I have to combine layouts. But let's just go ahead and finish this so that you can at least visualize this a little bit better. And we'll go bottom. Okay, so we have our boxes, but they're lined up next to each other. I will have to nest layouts in order to generate the same example where I have a box in all 4 corners if I'm using horizontal layouts. And I can't just use horizontal layouts. I have to use a combination of horizontal layouts and something else, like a vertical layout, for example. But what we can do is, let's go back to one of our first buttons. And at least I do want to specify, or at least show you, that the difference between auto and fill. So auto is going to keep the stuff inside based on what's inside it. Fill is going to do its best to stretch the box to be how much horizontal room it has to go. Okay, but let's go back to the example where we were trying to get these boxes all to show up. So right now we have a horizontal box, and let me just change a couple of these colors so you can see which ones we're working with. Go pink on this one, so they're at least different. Okay, so we have a white, blue, and a pink box. And if we take all of these and set these to fill, you'll notice that what it does is we have a horizontal box that is basically divided into 4 sections and fills our entire UI. And if we take all of these and I make them so they are believe it's... Let's take this first one and change our vertical alignment to fill it vertically. And the reason I'm doing this is I want to make this easier for you all to visualize what is happening. So this is what our horizontal layout looks like. Okay. Now, in order to make this work, to get our four tiny boxes in all four corners, we need to split this up. But before we do that, let's replace the horizontal box by right-clicking and choose Replace With, and let's use a vertical box. Now you'll notice that this vertical box does the exact same thing a horizontal does, except vertically. Makes sense, all right? So what we can do is we can take our items and we can set them to fill, each of them to fill, and what we get is we get the horizontal version of the vertical version of what the horizontal box was doing. So what we actually need to do, if we're going to use our Lego building blocks to create the same thing without using the canvas and without using overlays, is we kind of need to cut our vertical boxes up into horizontal boxes, or vice versa. Horizontal boxes up into vertical boxes. So let's take a look at that. Let's right click our vertical box and we're going to replace this with a horizontal. And then what we're going to do is inside of our horizontal, let's add a vertical. If I can find it. Here's our vertical box. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we are going to take our first two buttons and we are going to parent them in our vertical box. Okay, and this is important to understand. The stacking order is the order in which things happen. So the top thing is the first thing that gets added. So our pink box is first now, our white box is second, then our vertical box comes in, then the white box, then the blue box. You with me? Okay, so we need another vertical box in our horizontal. We need to make sure it's not parented, it is its own parent. And we're going to take both of these images and parent it to here. Okay, so now at least we have our four little boxes. Now we got to get them to show up in the corners. So how do we do this? We need our horizontal box. You'll notice our horizontal box is set by this green border to stretch the whole distance of our layout. But the boxes aren't drawing in the corners yet. So let's take our vertical box and choose Fill. Okay, both vertical boxes. Now we've divided our layout into 2 rows and 2 columns effectively by using a combination of vertical and horizontal boxes. So what we can do is we can take each of these images if we wanted to and set them to fill. And you'll notice that we now have all of our images, but they're technically the wrong size. They're not the 32 by 32 pixels that we want. And that's because currently they're set to fill. And when they fill, there's no padding, there's no buffer. So what we need is the idea of a padding or buffer. And there's a couple things that we could do to do that. We could use a border, we could use another image that's empty, whatever it is. It doesn't matter too much, but I'm just going to put a border in here. I'm going to change my image to be auto. And I'm going to change my border to be fill. Okay, and I'm going to change the color of my first image so that you can see it. We'll make it a nice yellow. Okay, so we're stacking here. So now our first image, this yellow box, is inside of a horizontal box, inside of a vertical box. So I like to do this to visualize what's happening, how this is all getting cut up. Then this middle piece, this is the border that we added. Right now it's visible because we made it white. I can make it invisible by setting its alpha to 0, so there's no space. And then we have our last image, right now set to auto. In order to get this to be the 32 by 32, if we just left align these images, what happens is we now have our yellow dot and our blue dot. They're in the top they're basically, we have our horizontal that divides this whole screen into two. Then we have our vertical that divides it into three. And we have a padding that is in here that we're just using a border for right now. And in fact, if we wanted to, we could make this black. Let's make it, red, just so you can kind of see that. So this stacking, slicing and dicing, getting the sizes set up is a little bit of the Lego building that I was referring to, and an understanding of how these pieces go together. So let's do the same thing for the right side. Let's add in our border as our buffer, and we're going to set our images to auto, and we'll right align them so that they line up. And there you have it. You have, and actually let's just change the color of this border a little bit so that you all can see left versus right. Okay, so now what we have is we have our entire widget divided up into sections that we can now use for each of our pieces. In this case, we're just drawing boxes and corners. But the whole goal here is to understand how we slice up our screen depending on which layout we choose in order to get the visuals that we want. So if we play this now, you'll notice that we have our yellow in the top, our bright pink, our white, and then our borders between. So that is, if I'm ever wondering what is happening, I will often go take the background of my border or the box or the image or whatever, change it to something that I can see, and look. And this is especially important when you're trying to get the sizing right. When you're trying to get the sizing of your UI and your button's hanging off, or it's too big or too small, or it's not drawing in the right place, these green boxes, when you click on this, will show you the size. So for example, this vertical box, this green outline is what it's supposed to be drawing. When we pick the horizontal box, this green outline is what it's supposed to be doing. Incidentally, if we wanted to, we could also add a border in between here and set it to be fill. And we could have a buffer in the horizontal space as well. And then we set this to be auto and this to be auto. And now what we've got is we've got a horizontal box divided into three and two vertical boxes divided into three. We've sort of created our own sort of borders, if you will. This one, if we set our visibility down to like 0.1 and our color to another blue, for example, you'll see now what this looks like. And now you can see our screen is divided based on how we've layered the horizontal and vertical boxes together through a combination of the size options, the fill options, etc. Now, with this as our backdrop, we can actually start to get to work, and we can actually start to build our user interface. So let's do it. First off, we need to make a decision. Are we going to be using overlays? Are we going to be using horizontal boxes? What do we want to do? I'm just going to use an overlay. In this case, it's going to be the easiest one. So with our overlay, this is going to be, I like to label these. I'm going to call this overlay main, for example. And then I am going to create, let's do this menu on the right first. The menu on the right is divided into three sections. They are vertically oriented. So I'm going to use a vertical box for this. Seems to make sense. So let's just go ahead and get our placeholder in there. And to do that, I need a vertical box. Let's take that and drop that in our main. And then this vertical box, let's go ahead and we are going to right align it and middle align it. So it's going to, you can barely see it right now. It's this little green dot. That's very tough to see. But if we do something simple, we are going to need, let's say, 3 images. Let's do 2 images and another vertical box, and I'll show you why in a second. So first, using our palette, we're going to drop in an image here, and then we're going to drop in one more vertical box. So what we've got is an image, then we're going to have a vertical box, and then we're going to have another image. And we need to make sure that this image is parented underneath our vertical box. So over here on the right, you can't see anything in here because we don't have anything inside the vertical box. So just as a placeholder, I'm going to put some text. And it's just going to be text block. And if I wanted to get even more explicit, I could say buttons go here, for example. Okay, so right now, our image, our top image is set, our bottom image, set that to fill. Oh wait, that's the wrong one. Bottom image, we can go like so. And this is our placeholder for this part of our UI. So how do we, let's go ahead and put in our placeholder actually for our heads up display down here at the bottom. Same thing. This one is a little bit interesting, and this is sort of why we went through the whole process of understanding the layering. So you could say that this is a vertical box and a horizontal box inside the vertical box when you look at this, because it's basically two stacked and then the bottom one has multiple rows. Or you could say that it's two completely separate pieces. They're not even stacked or inside, they're placed separately, however you want to do it. In this case, I am going to do this as a vertical box with a horizontal box inside of it. So let's go ahead and do that. Now this vertical box, I'm going to rename this. I'm going to call this vertical box, and this is going to be our menu, for example. And then, normally I would name all of these things, but for the sake of the demo, let's just keep rolling. So let's create another vertical box. And this is going to be our vertical box. Let's call it items, or I don't want to call it HUD. It's going to be info. Just call it info. Info and items. Sure, that's fine. Okay, and this one we are going to bottom align in the middle. So right now it's just a green dot. Same thing as before. We are going to use as a placeholder for now, just to, the point of this is to better understand how to lay out and how widget blueprints work. So we have our image. This is going to be our health bar, for example. And then we're going to put in a horizontal box inside of this. This horizontal box is going to be, for example, our ruins, abilities, whatever you want to call them. And inside of that, we are going to put in our images. So let's just duplicate this a bunch of times. And we're going to take this vertical box and it's going to fill. Now, we're going to be changing this a little bit because we probably don't want this to fill the whole screen as I have it here. Let's actually go back here and let's take our horizontal box. Wait a second. I accidentally duplicated the wrong thing. This is our horizontal box. It is a horizontal box. I need to drag an image inside of it. Oh, actually, it looks like what happened was I missed. Okay, so this is our image inside our horizontal box. Okay, and then it's image on top rather than using auto. Let's just center it. Okay, and we will get the sizing right here in a little bit. And we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8. We have 8 images. So now 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And then I'm going to put in one more in the middle as a placeholder. This is going to be a border, for example, and this is going to do some separation. And let's do we may change that to not be a border. We may change that to be something that we can specify. So for example, if I wanted to, I could wrap this. This is another one of my favorites. If you right click, if I wrap this border with a size box, what happens is I can actually specify the width of this size box. And I can change my border to be black. That's probably what the problem was. Okay, so now we have a break. Okay, so we have the placeholders for each of our pieces. Now, how do we get our pieces in? This is where the arts and crafts time begins. What we need to do, hopefully you have a concept for what you're building. Let me clean ours up so we have just the pieces that we need. And what you do is you basically make sure that you can go through and cut out each of these pieces separately. So for example, what I did was I used the wand tools, whatever your drawing tools of choice are, and you basically take these and you save them as individual images. Okay, so what we can do is we can basically export all of these. Now, there's all kinds of fancy stuff in Photoshop to do this, but if just for ease, for what I'm doing, if I just Control C, Control V each layer, I can get a image on a separate Photoshop file that is the right size and transparent, and I can choose file, and in this case I'm going to export as a PNG file. Now this is something that's worth noting. The reason we're going to export it as a PNG is we need to export the image as something that has transparency. If you're new to images and understanding how all this works, generally speaking, if you look at a JPEG or a photo that your camera takes or anything, it is basically just red, green, and blue, and it shows what the image looks like. But in what we build, we also have a fourth channel, the transparency channel, and JPEGs do not store transparency. So we only have a couple few choices. One is a Targa file, TGA. Another one is PNG. Another one is you can use the PSD file. However, they do not seem to have done a great job of updating the PSD files format interpreter for Unreal Engine, so you can get all kinds of like white pre-multiplying borders and stuff like that. Overall point is, in my experience, I either go to PNG or Targa right now. It adds a little bit of extra source art, but it does not do anything bad as far as, you know, the size and the gain, etc. So I am going to actually save this out, and we'll put this in export. I'm going to put this in a folder called UI tutorial, and we're going to call this is going to be our title bar. This is going to be what did we call this? This was called our Ruins title bar. So this is going to be the Ruins title bar. No, it doesn't exist. I'm trying to make it. So let's add a folder. Do this the hard way. This is the UI tutorial. And inside here, this is going to be a Ruins title bar. Okay, so now that we have that, let's go ahead and import that into Unreal. So inside of our UI folder for our tutorial, I'm going to create a new folder. I'm going to call this texture, for example. And inside of here, I'm going to import that first image that we just created. And unfortunately, there we go, Ruins title bar. All right, so we'll open that up, and you'll notice that it pops in. If we double click on it, we now have our Ruins title bar here. Okay, so if we go back to our HUD, we can now take this image, because this was an image, and we can set the brush to be an actual image. And the image that we're going to set it to be is our Ruins title bar. And we want it to be, our sizing is important here. All right, so we need to set the image size. So what was the image size that we had? In this particular case, image size, 581 by 88. So for the purpose of this demo, we're just going to be a little bit Wild West with our sizes, but you can see that that is what that image is supposed to look like. And just to double check, this mouse cursor position is 667. Over here on the right is 1251. That is about 500. If we press play, you'll notice that we have our Ruin title bar now showing on the screen. Cool. Okay, so we're going to do the same thing again, but this time we're going to grab a couple of our abilities. Now, I'm not going to export every single one of these during this demo. I'm just going to do one more. So let's grab, we'll just grab this one. Okay, and let's export this as a PNG. And in this case, we're going to do, I'll try something different this time. We'll go PNG 24. Bicubic, because I noticed that there was, actually no, hold on a second. Matte, none. Let's do no matte this time. And let's save this. And this is going to be our Ruin item 1, for example, item A. Cool. So let's go back to Unreal. Same thing. We're going to import that into here. Here's our Ruin item A. And we are going to fill that in for our images. Now, let's take a look at our image size here, just to double check it. This was 56 by 56. I'm going to come back to that here in a second. So let's take this here. We'll set this to 56 and 56. And let's check and get our image to be Ruin item A. Okay. Now, I am going to basically just duplicate this for the purpose of the demo. In this particular case, let's go 1, 2, 3, 4. Let's just pretend all of these are different. We'll do the same thing here. Let's take these, duplicate that, 2, 3, 4, and drop this in the middle. Okay. And what we've got is if we play, we now have our heads-up display down here at the bottom. There's a couple problems with it. How do we fix them? First off, our buttons are so close together, we can't really read them. That's where padding can come in, for example. So we can take our images, and right now there's no padding on them. If we just pick all of our images, we could put, like, for example, a padding of, if we put 10, it'll put a 10 pixel border basically around all of them. And now when we take a look, you can see these are much more readable. So 10 might be a bit much, but overall you get the general idea. Now, we would do the exact same thing with the other side, our layout that's over here on the right, this one. In this particular case, all we're going to do is we're going to export 2 images really quickly. Let's just make sure we got the right ones. So this one we're going to take, and we're going to do this, and go new, paste it in. Sort of a bummer because it's got a little wing on the edge. So let's change that real quick. And I'm just going to change that by just chopping it off, just so we're not dealing with that. All right, let's take this. Now we don't have that little wing on the side. Let's go ahead and export this. And we'll do a quick export as a PNG. Nope, that's not what I want to do. I want to go back to my, I like to use this legacy one because that's just the one I'm used to. Same settings, etc. This is going to be our menu top accent, for example. And while we're here, let's do our bottom. which is this one. Same thing. We're going to export this as our bottom accent. Save menu bottom accent. Okay, and then the fun one is our buttons. So let's take a button, any button. Let's take this one, create that, paste that in, and let's go ahead and export that. Save this as our menu button. Now you'd need to be a little more specific because you're probably going to have more than one menu in your game, but you get the general idea. If we come back to our textures, let's just import all of the stuff we just made. And we'll do it all at once, all three of them. Let's just save these just in case we have one of those crashes. And all we're going to do, since we have our layout done, is in our HUD, we're going to replace our images with our new ones. So let's check to see the image size on our top accent, in this case, 152 by 98. So this top button over on the menu should be the image that we brought in. So this is going to be top accent 152 by 98. No, that's 98. Okay, and our bottom one, let's just assume it's the same. It's probably not exactly the same, but that's okay. 152. And ideally it would be the same. Let's do this as bottom accent. Great. So now we have our top and bottom accent, and we have our buttons. So there's a couple different ways, but let's just take a look at what this looks like so far. You can see we have our UI over here on the right, tracks with our character. We have our UI on the bottom. They're all in place. They're arranged the way we want them. Specifically, we probably want at least some kind of buffer over here on the right. So if we take our overlay main, let's see here, this menu, what we can do is we can put padding on our menu on the right side. Let's say 50, and it'll bump it up. And let's put some padding on our bottom one so that we can bump it up. Let's say 50. So we're a little bit off the top and bottom. That'll make it a little bit more readable. So we have some space between the side and not. Now, the HUD is there to use while we're playing. Okay? If we were to display another menu, we would probably give it a background, blur it out, or make it dark so you couldn't see the player. But this is meant to be here while we're playing, for example. This shows our items, etc. However, the menu on the right is a little bit different because remember the idea was, originally I said that they would show your list of objectives. But if we did actually want to make it clickable and a button, there's a couple other steps. But before we get to that, let me go back to one other thing so that you've at least heard of it. Right now, the sizes that we've been using are pretty all over the place. In certain things in Unreal Engine, and I'm not saying you should do this with UI, but if you can, you want to use powers of 2. What that means is if you use 2, 8, 16, 32, 64, etc., Unreal is able to resize them, scale them super easily. In the case of these, I'm not worried about it. It's one thing for the UI. I'm willing to do that. But for something that is like a repeatable button, maybe it's better to have that as a power of 2. So instead of this button being, what is it currently? 56 by 56, I would just go 64 by 64 for that. That way I can scale it up, down, whatever you need to do, lot it based on the platform, etc. So it's just something to at least have heard about. In general, thinking about the ability to scale up and down, power of 2 when you're dealing with textures is something to keep in mind. Okay, so back here in our engine, we have our UI. It's showing up, it pops up on the screen, and it works. Now, what if What if the UI wasn't actually the HUD and it wasn't showing us information and it was actually buttons that we wanted to click? You'll notice I have no mouse. I have no ability to click anything in the UI. That is another lesson. And what we're going to be doing there, actually before we get there, let's at least put in our final buttons. Okay, let's just do that. What we're going to do is let's create a button that's inside this vertical box. And this button is going to have so this is the button that we click, and you'll notice that it has there's a lot of different options here, and we're going to be talking a little bit more about buttons in a little bit, but let's take a look at this. Is going to be our ruin. Do we call them ruin buttons? Nope. What did we call that? Let's just click on it and pull it in. And we just called it menu button. We should have just kept all that stuff the same. Okay, so let's just drop that in here. Okay, so we have our menu button, and this is using a specific image, but there's a lot of tricks with buttons so that you can actually reuse them, etc. And having text on them, all those kinds of things. But let's just go ahead and get a few of these in here so that we get kind of what we were talking about, or at least what we had in our little sample. So these are all of our buttons, and as before, I'm going to put in a little bit of padding on the top, let's say 2 pixels, and let's see what that looks like. Pretty cool, pretty good. Okay, so the goal of this was to help you all, especially if you've never done any kind of web design, etc., to get a broad level picture and understanding about what goes into the planning and thinking about how you potentially set up the art and the widgets for laying out your art in a Unreal Engine user widget. So through a combination of planning and cutting and understanding how the sizing and the layering of the horizontal widgets and all those things, hopefully you found this helpful. As always, all feedback is welcome. Go ahead and throw those down in the comments below. Let us know what kinds of things you're looking for in the future. And if you dig what we're doing, help us out. You know how this works. Spread the word. Let people know what we're about. We have the Patreon. We have the Discord. Hop into those, ask questions, etc. And for our next video, we're going to be talking about, as far as UI basics go, we're going to be taking a look at actually connecting our buttons to do things, making it so that it's not just a HUD, it is actually interactable. We need to change the way the mouse and the input mode works to do that, and that is coming up in a future video. Thanks for checking it out. See you in the next one, and hopefully in one of our upcoming live Unreal Engine tutorials, which are usually we do those every week. Hop in, we hope to see you there soon. Take it easy.